Elisabeth Kendall is a member of the Faculty of Oriental Studies at Oxford University. Her interest in poetry led her to Yemen, where she has become familiar with the dynamics of the current civil strife in that country. Among other studies, she has conducted a comprehensive survey of the hopes and aspirations of the residents in al-Mahrah. She is uniquely suited to speak to us on the situation in eastern Yemen today. Welcome back to the English Hour on ANN Satellite Television. It's great to have you with us. Our guest today is Dr. Elisabeth Kendall. Elisabeth, thank you so much for being with us. You are our one and only true British expert on Yemen. I mean, we've got many from historical times, but you're in there, you know what's going on as of now, and it's such a joy to have you with us.
Well, thank you. It's my privilege to be here. I wouldn't call myself the only expert.
Well, there you are.
Perhaps the only one still going in.
Yes, the only one still going in, and that really counts for a lot. And we have three subjects. We're going to talk about poetry. We're going to talk about, well, about the whole issue of al-Qaeda and life in East Yemen, which is going to be fascinating. Thank you so much, and bless your heart for being our guest.
Thank you. Thank you, my pleasure.
Eastern Yemen is currently split between several factions. Parts of Hadramaut are now fully under the control of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. In East Yemen, life remains traditional. Loyalty is to the tribe, so much so that the tradition of revenge killings has played a significant part in the present conflict. Poetry, we're talking about jihadist poetry, and what our listeners won't realize is that it is such a feature of the whole, well, not just the whole ISIS life, the whole al-Qaeda life, the whole jihadist approach, but then it's a feature of Arab life, isn't it? Poetry is in the heart of whole Arab heritage. Is what, I mean, they have competitions on television for the best poet in the Middle East.
They do. They have an equivalent of, or what we might call Pop Idol or Britain's Got Talent.
Yes.
Sha'ir al-Milyoon, which is either translates as poet of the masses or $1 million poet, if you like, a million rial poet, a million dirham poet. So the prizes are big, and the popularity is enormous of quite a classical style poetry still today.
Yes, I remember when I was a boy and I travelled to Iraq, and I met a guy called Jamil Shalash, who was then the head of culture under Saddam. You know, it was with the early days of Saddam.
Oh.
And this guy, I was only 20 years old, and he took me to lunch and recited great chunks of Arab poetry, interspersed with glasses of whiskey. But anyway, I suddenly realized how much poetry meant to the Arab world. I had no idea. But that was your introduction to Yemen. It was poetry, wasn't it? That was how you went in the first place.
I was looking for poetry and looking for evidence of its role today. And of course, in Yemen in particular, having been a tribal society that very obviously predates Islam, poetry has an incredibly long pedigree. It's an oral tradition, an oral culture, and perhaps the poetry that's still most famous in secondary literature about classical Arabic poetry are the pre-Islamic tribal poets. And so what interested me was, how is that tradition still being continued today? Is it? And if so, what kind of role does it play? In fact, I found very similar to what you've just mentioned, that it is still an integral part of everyday life. That fascinated me. In fact, I did some analysis to try to work out how great a part it was of daily life. I I thought, what better way to find out than to actually ask? So I asked over 2,000 tribesmen and women whether poetry was still important to them today in their daily lives. And of course, I hid that question in a battery of other questions.
Sure.
I didn't want to promote a particular answer or draw attention to it. And yet 74% of those questioned stated that poetry was either important or very important in their daily lives today. And I thought that was remarkable. They had a choice of 6 answers, so, you know, this was by no means a given. And
this is in eastern Yemen?
This is in eastern Yemen.
Yes.
Yes, my sample was limited to eastern Yemen, but it was a very strong sample. It was scientifically randomised. But breaking down that sample a little bit further, I discovered that it was more popular amongst men than amongst women, slightly. So over 80% of men thought poetry was very important or important. That might seem like a surprise, particularly when we also take into account that it was more important to those who lived in the desert than to those who live in a sedentary situation, perhaps along the coast, and also very slightly more important to those from a lower economic background, a lower educational background, or education made little difference, let's put it like that, and also amongst those who carry a weapon. So it's quite counterintuitive to the way in which we perceive poetry, where we imagine it to be an elite occupation, an elite pastime. There, it isn't, and it's mainly men who engage in the recitation of poetry, so it's no surprise that we would find men rating it and valuing it more.
And more amongst those who are carrying arms than...
Very slightly, but I think the more important correlation that came out was that it was more prevalent in a desert setting, because of course that has strong implications for the kinds of terrain in which we see jihadist groups taking root. Lots of deserts in the east of Yemen, the stronghold of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. We have lots of desert in Iraq and Syria and Libya, and also in Egypt's Sinai. So this has implications across jihadist movements around the Middle East.
And of course here social media is not reaching them. We always think of these groups as being held together by the internet, but here, what is it, 3% or something in the interior of...
Good, yes.
The
So 3%, according to my data, of tribesmen and women in al-Mahrah governorate, which is a huge governorate in the far east of Yemen, have access to the internet on a regular basis, have an internet connection. Only 3%. So you have to ask yourself, how do ideas travel? How does word spread? We often, in the West, like to focus on what we can access easily from jihadist movements. And that would be what we see on Twitter, what we see on Facebook. We can easily intercept that. But what we can't intercept so easily is how messages travel by word of mouth. And don't forget, this is also very cheap. You pen a poem, you don't even need a pen or paper, you memorise it. And then, of course, it gets passed on almost on the wind. It jumps borders, it jumps checkpoints, it sticks in the collective memory. And even when internet content is removed, it stays. You can't get rid of it again. It's there. I think one particularly interesting point to consider, however, is that even over the last couple of years, when we have seen an increase in internet activity around Yemen, even a little bit in the east, and we have seen an increase in video production, poetry still plays a central role. You might think that in a tweet, which is only 140 characters or so, that you can't possibly put a poem in, but you can still get a rhyming couplet in there, or you can put in a link to an external site, which is quite often done, sites like Golf Up or Just Paste It, which then give you the whole poem. So it doesn't the use and spread and resonance of poetry is not precluded by the spread of technology.
Okay, well, we're going to have to hear one. You've got two, I think. Well, let's have the first of them. And this is jihadist poetry you're going to give us.
It is.
Is this Yemeni poetry?
This one is a Yemeni poem, yes.
Okay.
In fact, it's a Hadrami poem.
Well, could you maybe you could read it in Arabic, because most of our listeners are Arabic. Well, nearly all of our listeners are Arab speaking. But then maybe give us a summary in English. No, just the gist.
Sure.
That would be really great.
Yeah, I'm just going to give you an extract because the poem is about 26 lines long, so
okay.
I'll just give you a quick extract of some of my favourite verses. من لي بمثل فوارس من نوعهم لا يرتدون الذل والإرجاء لم يشهد الميدان مثل صنيعهم أسدا ضمادا خاضت الحجاء أعلام رشد والملاهم منهم أمطار خير جابت البيداء شمس تضيء وعنجم لا تنطفي والوجه إشراقا كبدر جاء. So you can kind of catch the lilt there,
yes,
I think.
It's beautiful.
The reason I've picked those verses, not because I share the ideology in any way, obviously, but because I think they demonstrate very well the kind of role that jihadist poetry plays. I've done a very rough translation of them, which
yes.
I can read for you if you like. Where do I find the like of knights like them, who do not accept being humiliated and put off? The battlefield has never witnessed an act such as theirs, a wounded lion plunged into battle. Banners of integrity and the battles they fought, pure rains penetrated the deserts. A sun shining and stars that are never extinguished, faces glowing like a risen half moon. So I think you can already see that there's a lot of natural imagery in there. And this, even though it's a modern invention, this poem is a modern invention, this harks back to the kinds of natural themes that you would find all the way through pre-Islamic poetry and into Islamic times, that resonates with a desert environment. And these are words of praise. When you're comparing someone to the sun or stars or a risen half moon, this is beauty. These are virtuous people whom we're speaking about and describing. And don't forget, they're also being likened to knights who are brave, who have integrity, like rain in the desert. This is also a very positive parallel. Now, if you actually look into the history of what this poem is referring to, and you can get that from the context and from the names of the martyrs who are being described, you'll discover that, in fact, they were a group of young men who were rumbled in a safe house in a town in Hadramaut in the east of Yemen and shot in cold blood by the security services. So this is very different from the kind of glorious death that's being described here. And yet they're being lionized, they're being described as heroes, knights, they're having this natural imagery associated with them. And later on in the poem, they're likened to companions of the Prophet, the uncle of the Prophet, Hamza, and their glorious death is likened to one of the earliest battles of Islam, the Battle of Uhud. So it's quite different, the reality that the poem presents from the reality that we might perceive. And that's important because it's extremely powerful in ensuring that recruits who die in cold blood, who don't even die in a suicide mission, they haven't achieved anything, to our minds, are still upheld as heroes, are still integrated into the oral tradition and enshrined in the culture. They'll always be remembered. And so that's quite encouraging for future recruits. And, of course, it posits today's jihad at the same level of the earliest conquests of Islam, as a continuum.
It is regarded as kind of martyrdom, isn't it, this kind of death? I mean, you saw this amongst Palestinians who would put up posters of their dead and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't appreciate it. We have none of the same poetry in our. Well, we can't have the same poetry, but we don't appreciate the emotional drive that is resonating for the people there.
No, I guess the closest you might get to it would be a young generation maybe thinking about rap lyrics, about, setting out their agenda, their quite simple political views, often simple, not always simple, their telescoping of a complicated political landscape into digestible black and white images. That starts to approximate the kind of effect this would have amongst young people. The difference in the Arab world is that it's not just a pastime of the young. It spans generations.
But in this context, in this ideological context of war and uprising and so on, is poetry an exclusive arena for the jihadist? Do we see the other forces in Yemen also using poetry, or is it something that is this kind of martyrdom poetry is just on one side?
No, it's not. I guess this kind of poetry latches onto three major themes that are running throughout Arabic poetry throughout the ages and have always been harnessed for political purposes, and those would be madh, praise, hijar, lampoon, so criticising the enemy, and also ritha, which means lament. And so this kind of lament, praise, lampoon, as well as other themes, hamasa, warmongering if you like, can be used by other political movements too. What I think we see perhaps more specific to the jihadist movement is that it's used a lot because of its ability to construct an alternative reality, to tell the story in a way that perhaps diverts attention from what is a very grim truth. Instead of focusing on the blackened and distorted and mutilated corpse of a suicide bomber, you focus on him being welcomed into the arms of the virgins of paradise.
They do that, do they?
Yeah. And of course this is not something that would be easily transferable to video. We don't get footage in jihadist videos of mock-ups of what paradise might look like.
No.
But the poetry can construct that in a more subtle way. And also the jihadist movements tend to, I think, use a lot more of it and collect it into magazines, into volumes, so that it magnifies the voice. It has more of an impact. I'm not aware of many projects, political parties around the Arab world today, or movements that try to collect, collated volumes that support their ideologies in the same way.
Very thought-provoking, because there needs to be a counter-narrative, and all of us need to think about that. We should think about that as individuals. Where I feel that we don't have jihadism is an ideology, but it's also a sense of community, isn't it? You're fighting along with your friend, for what you believe in, and then we're not offering the counter-narrative to this. We're not offering the ideology, the sense of community, for the sense of love, if you like, as the counter-narrative. That needs to be out there, the sense of brotherhood and sisterhood of mankind, and a kind of ideology of love. I think that we need to think a little about what we're promoting. Do you have
Actually, I don't have any more with me.
That's all right,
I thought there wouldn't be too much appetite for hearing.
Oh, that's good. Well, but it is really exciting. I'm really thrilled to hear about that. We have to go on to our next subject, but do you want to Any last point on?
Well, I'd just like to pick up on your point about a counter-narrative. I think when you say that, we must be promoting a counter-narrative, I agree to a large extent with you, but I think it's very important that our role is limited to facilitating existing counter-narratives that are locally produced to perhaps be given a greater voice, and obviously not to invent them ourselves or to...
No, but it's a challenge to our listeners. I mean, they can produce a counter-narrative if they feel, as I hope they do, that there's a more loving future for the Middle East rather than one of ongoing war in some path to Armageddon.
Yes.
Then they're the...
An authentic counter-narrative, definitely, yes.
That's what we need.
A manipulated artificial one constructed by the powers that be in the West? No.
Right, okay. Well, that's a challenge. And it's very interesting, very thought-provoking, and we forget how important poetry is. Gosh. Thank you for that. We move on to our next subject. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula relies on poetry to spread ideas and communicate. This is partially due to the ease with which poems may move across boundaries, being learned and recited. Other more conventional platforms, such as internet propaganda, do not have this wide reach, given that in some of Yemen's governorates, such as al-Mahrah, very few residents have internet access. Jihadist poetry lionizes martyrs and celebrates the lineage of the mujahideen among local tribes. It appeals to tribal pride and recasts passive death by drone attack as heroic martyrdom. Al-Qaeda. I always pronounce that word wrong because I'm not so good at my Arabic. I should say, well, al-Qaeda.
Al-Qaeda.
Okay, al-Qaeda. In the Yemen, or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula,
Exactly.
more exactly. I mean, you've been living, working with people you just came back from the Hadramaut 3 weeks ago or something. You're there. You're regularly there. It's astonishing to us that you can and are able to travel in this way. Tell us about my understanding from you, really, because I have no other source. I know nobody else who is in eastern Yemen. My understanding is that what we call Islamic State, Daesh, ISIS, whatever we like to call it, I guess we can't, if we're talking about its activities in Yemen, we wouldn't call it Daesh, because Daesh implies Syria and Iraq.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
But nonetheless, whatever it is and whatever name you give it, it's not as important as we assume. Al-Qaeda is more important in Yemen, in a Yemeni context. Is that right?
Well, my research indicates that Al-Qaeda definitely has prominence over, let's call it Islamic State, and leave out the Iraq and Syria.
I don't really like
now.
doing that. It seems to give it some sort of... But anyway, for the purposes of our interview, we'll call it Islamic State. This group, it has more prominence.
Well, I think it has a long pedigree, or longer pedigree, and it's more local. It has stronger local roots in the Arabian Peninsula, and so it's better attuned to integrating into communities on the Arabian Peninsula. Islamic State, by contrast, and by the way, I believe that to an Arabic ear, Daesh is almost like saying ISIS, because of course it stands for Dawlat al-Islamiyya.
Yes,
so
of course.
It doesn't make a great deal of difference, despite people saying that it has a resonance with das, which is a negative verb. I think it's slightly overplayed. This is perceived more as a foreign movement, that it has been imported, and it's good at magnifying its presence, I believe, because it has quite a slick social media presence. It's quick to claim attacks, and the attacks that it does do have been extremely brutal and quite extremely destructive. So it tends to grab attention. But in terms of numbers, attacks committed by al-Qaeda still greatly outweigh those committed by Islamic State. And we can't always be sure that Islamic State is correct in claiming attacks. There are certainly rumours of other political groupings being responsible for some of these attacks. I won't name any names, but of course, once Islamic State has claimed credit for them, it's easy for us to latch onto that. What we have to be careful of is that we don't assume that every group of disgruntled, unhappy, alienated youth waving a black flag in front of an iPhone and screaming Dawlat al-Islam are actually members of or official affiliates of Islamic State in the sense that they represent a wilaya, a province of the Islamic State. If you did count them up, if you counted them up via all the video claims, you'd have about 10 provinces of the Islamic State inside Yemen itself.
Yes.
But it's very difficult to understand how widespread that is, and I have my doubts that the numbers of adherents and the quality of adherents, the maturity and the spread is on a par with al-Qaeda.
So al-Qaeda itself, it's obviously, it had, I know very little. I know that there were people like Yusuf al-Ayari who was killed in 2003, but who was one of the key figures in the Saudi, who was in al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. I know about the drone strikes. I know that we've taken out a lot of al-Qaeda people in the past year in Yemen. Some would argue that's counterproductive. I don't know whether you would or whether you would even want to go there, but the point is that these people who have been regarded by us, I think quite rightly, as horrendous, are now the soft option.
You could articulate it like that.
It's very unfair. I'm not putting in, no, I shouldn't even put you in that position. But what I'm trying to say, because you have to go back and live and work in Yemen, but what I'm trying to say is really what is driving al-Qaeda originally? If you tell me if I'm wrong, we had the al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and quite a few Yemenis went over at that time and fought the Russians and so on. And in due course, they came back. My perception, which may be quite naive, is that there were a couple of hundred of them. And then drone attacks by the West was one factor in many, by which they because of the need for vengeance when you're attacked, they acquired more and more recruits. And so now, whereas you had a couple of hundred some years ago, you're talking thousands. Is that naive, or is that? No,
I think you've managed to identify one very important factor, one amongst many factors, but it's a very important factor in how support grows. So I think we need to be very careful about the notion of drone strikes. I totally understand why governments believe that drone strikes are a useful option because we're at a distance from the battle itself. However, you cannot underestimate the damage that's done by killing one wrong target, or killing a target and catching a dozen other people at the same time. The idea, one Pentagon official was quoted as saying a while back, well, you know, if they're travelling in the backs of trucks with guns and bombs, then they're not innocent. But actually, you know, in the context of Yemen, and particularly in the context of the current security situation, that's not unusual to be travelling in trucks with guns. And well, I've done it, and I'm not a member of al-Qaeda. I haven't travelled with bombs, but certainly guns. Now, and so you can kick off a cycle of revenge amongst those who were never previously supportive of al-Qaeda, but you kill one of them, they want to kill you back. And they will support al-Qaeda because these guys are doing it. But there's another angle to the drone strikes, which I'd like to point up, which is that some of the leaders of al-Qaeda right now, these are mature ideologues who have been around for a while, who perhaps less, in one sense, less hot-headed than you know, the young, brutal members of Islamic State, and are vehemently against the outright carnage of Islamic State. They don't believe in blowing up mosques for the sake of it, you know, just because there might be a few allegedly Shiite worshippers there. It's not worth the carnage, or blowing up public places. At least that's what they articulate. And so, is it really in our interests to get rid of this leadership? Not necessarily. I mean, it's quite useful for the counter-jihad to be able to keep the rank and file away from joining Islamic State, and in a relative-only sense, slightly more moderate in terms of jihad. But there are other ways that al-Qaeda, you know, attracts. It has an active outreach agenda, both amongst youth and amongst the older generation. It steps into the vacuum that's left by state inadequacies. If you have a state that is not filtering down the benefits of the state to outlying communities, such as those in the east of Yemen, where the al-Qaeda strongholds are, then if someone comes along and helps you build a water pump, hook up an electricity supply or a generator, start an education program, for example, then they might not like you, but they might be prepared to tolerate you. I'm not saying that populations under al-Qaeda rule in Hadramaut in particular want it or have joined the movement. I'm saying that they might be in a position where they would tolerate it.
Because of its good works?
Because of its, I wouldn't call, yes, I mean, let's not call them good works, let's call it practical agenda, practical help.
So, I mean, in real terms, does al-Qaeda control most of eastern Yemen? Does it control the Hadramaut?
Control's too strong a word. It certainly controls al-Mahrah, the capital of Hadramaut, and surrounding areas. It looks like there is an Islamic cell, Islamic State cell further to the north, but very difficult to know how much buy-in that really has. It did manage to carry out a spectacular attack in Shabam recently, but by all accounts, it doesn't have widespread support, according to the tribesmen whom I'm speaking to. In al-Mahrah itself, you know, the al-Qaeda model has adapted. It's no longer trying to implement government all on its own. It's being smarter about securing community buy-in, about ruling in conjunction with local figurehead councils, such as the Hadrami People's Council. It's an uneasy alliance, but it therefore means that there's shared blame and shared responsibility.
And the just to come back to this, but ISIS, Daesh or Islamic State does not control territory in the same way.
Not in the same way.
No.
No, not in the same way. These are isolated cells.
So they're not, there is no port controlled by Islamic State. Nothing. No major.
No, not at the moment.
Right.
No, but of course both of these organisations are learning organisations. They learn from each other and they inflect off each other. So, for example, we occasionally see al-Qaeda come down harder on Sharia, on Islamic law, when it gets severe criticism from Islamic State, not just inside Yemen, but in Syria and Iraq, where they're saying, oh, look at al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. They're not implementing Sharia law in al-Mahrah. They're not proper Muslims. And then we see al-Qaeda perhaps trying to flex its muscles a little more. And then it steps back again, because if it oversteps the mark, it risks a groundswell of opposition against it, such as when it blew up the shrines recently in al-Mahrah, and about 500 people came out onto the streets, mainly youth, to protest.
Yeah, that's a step too far. So we see this, and it remains on the ascendancy. Al-Qaeda is increasing in strength.
I believe it is. I believe it is. It's not increasing necessarily in popularity. But the more destabilized Yemen becomes, the longer the war continues, the easier it is for al-Qaeda to link its agenda to other localized agendas, whether it be fighting the Houthi rebels from the north, positing what essentially are struggles about politics and land, territory, as a sectarian struggle. And, you know, let me give you an example. When the war began, well, let's say when Saudi started its air campaign against Yemen in March, al-Qaeda was recruiting in Hadramaut to send men to go and fight in Aden and in the south on behalf of what they perceived to be a defence against either northern tribes coming down, people stealing their territory, a political takeover, an old sort of north-south struggle, whatever it was.
Sure.
And because they had the recruitment apparatus so finely tuned compared to the state and to the government that had exited, men signed up. Roughly 13 boats were sent to Aden, they were signing up with al-Qaeda because that was the infrastructure that allowed them to go and help defend their people and their lands. By the time they came back, a few months later, some of them had also then absorbed the ideology. But they hadn't gone with the ideology. They'd been exposed to it, they'd lived with it day, night, and it started to sink in. So the point I'm making is that this war must stop. The peace talks in Geneva must succeed, because otherwise we have a much greater problem on our hands.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we need the international community can play a role if it chooses to, and chooses to focus on Yemen. God, I hope that it will. It's such a, well, it's a country. I've only driven into eastern Yemen from Oman, and only once with my wife and briefly, so I know very, very little of it. But if it is anything like the interior of Oman, it is a wonderful place.
I think that's worth stressing. It is a wonderful place. You know, we only ever hear bad news about Yemen. Anyone who's been there falls in love with the place. It's a fantastic place with hospitable people who, you know, in my experience, could not be more welcoming. Let's say the vast majority, obviously, not everybody. But, you know, it would be nice to concentrate on some of the more positive aspects of Yemeni hospitality, the beauty of the land.
Well, that brings us straight into our third subject then. Let's do that. Let's talk about eastern Yemen, if we can. In the wake of the 2011 Arab Spring, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula took control of several cities in eastern Yemen, establishing emirates and implementing Sharia law, although generally avoiding the more severe punishments of amputation. In May of 2015, al-Qaeda relinquished power to its local allies, the Sons of Hadramaut, in the region containing Yemen's third largest port, al-Mahrah. This highlights the degree to which al-Qaeda attempts to cater to local tribal customs and authority. In addition, al-Qaeda provides security and invests in civilian infrastructure, which proves attractive to Yemenis from insecure and deprived areas. Perhaps for this reason, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is proving more of a rallying organization for jihadists in Yemen than is Daesh. Additionally, there is little appetite for the Daesh brand in Yemen, even in the Sunni East, as Yemenis are generally hostile to central rule or clerical authority in non-religious matters. So, wow, you've been there, you've lived there, and lived in the interior. I have the limited experience. Well, we lived in Oman for 6 years, my wife and I, and traveled in the interior a lot. And if you drove past a Bedou home in the interior and didn't stop, they'd come out and chase you. I remember that very well. They'd chase you in there because they wanted to offer you hospitality. It was such an issue. It is, I imagine, but tell me if I'm wrong, I imagine that it is very similar. The women, I presume, are veiled, and the society is very tribal. Your allegiance is to the tribe, right or wrong, I presume. The tribe comes first. But you tell me, because you're the one who's lived there and been there.
Well, I should just say for the record, I have not lived there.
Right, well, but visited.
I'm in and out,
Well,
but
that's exceptional of itself.
So, but my experience is that really the hospitality is second to none. I'm constantly trying not to let people know that I'm coming, because you don't want them to slaughter a goat or a camel or prepare a big feast, because that's expensive, but they're so welcoming. If they know you're coming, they will. And everyone extends an invitation. I don't think I've ever bought any food ever when I've been in the east of Yemen, because you're just invited all of the time. But what I would say is, the reason I'm talking specifically about eastern Yemen, as opposed to Yemen as a whole, is that the life, the customs, the identity varies so enormously from region to region. I mainly reside, when I'm in Yemen, in the al-Mahrah governorate, and this has its own language. Even Mahri, it's not a dialect of Arabic; it's a separate, modern Southern Arabian language. I need an interpreter to put Mahri into Arabic. So many of the younger people in the tribes do speak Arabic, and so they can, help me communicate. I only know a few phrases and a couple of words in Mahri that help me get by in social situations. But I use Arabic. But they have their own dance, their own dress. The women wear something called a budail for everyday wear, which is a much looser, more flowing robe than the very strict black veil and head cover that we see on formal occasions in al-Mahrah or generally around Yemen. So
just to pick up on that business of the women, because just it interests me. I'm familiar, for example, in the interior of Oman, you go to Bahraini or you go anywhere, you very often will find women with this sort of leather mask, and then the headdress and the black robes, but with the kind of a leathery mask. They don't wear that in the interior?
Less so. You would cover your face, but you wouldn't wear the the full-on leathery mask
No,
necessarily. No.
It's interesting. So,
but I mean, one point to make here is that I was very surprised, having even travelled around many parts of the Arab world, with how feisty the women are in certainly in the east of Yemen. They have strong opinions. They are not afraid to articulate those strong opinions. They make their views known. Last month, when I was out there, I had a coordination meeting with a whole range of different volunteer organisations. We're trying to bring them together to see how their work intersects and how they might learn from each other. And women were asked to present as well. They all sat in a corner, fully veiled. But when they came up onto the stage to speak one by one, they were powerful speakers in a room full of men, and were not swayed from their argument. They've got good ideas. I think we underestimate the role of women, even behind the men, And we think, oh, poor oppressed women, they're one of 4 wives often. How do they manage? They're so oppressed. But actually, it's a slightly different way of looking at it. In some respects, they're actually empowered. In some respects, and in the tribes, in the deserts, you will even get women sitting with men.
Interesting. So, and when you say in the tribes in the desert, I mean, where do people live? They live in small houses in the desert. Are you talking a Bedouin population that's moving across the region with their flocks? The men moving across? How is life structured?
Yes, good question. Even those who have visited al-Mahrah, for example, will tend to stick along the coast because that's where the main road travels. And it's very beautiful. And of course, the coast means easy flow of traffic and sedentary communities arise. But once you get over the plateau and out into the deserts, which then blend into the empty quarter, it's quite different. There are settlements, a few concrete houses here and there, but you find also that people will pitch their tents around various groupings of sort of concrete housing and move around according to where their flocks are grazing. So it's still nomadic in many areas. And I was actually shocked at some of the appalling living conditions. Especially when the rains come, as they do occasionally, the tents get drenched, the children get wet and sick, everything's soaking, and you think, where is the state in this? These kinds of communities are easy pickings for groups like al-Qaeda, really, because you've got lots of children with nothing to do, no aspiration, no hope, no proper schooling, no education, even when a school exists. Doesn't have a teacher, doesn't have any books, doesn't have any pens. What's the point? And so,
So you have these shells of buildings that are not used as schools, but they're called schools.
Often, often. And even if you do have children sitting in them, I visited schools where the children were sitting dutifully in class, but they weren't being taught and they didn't have any books. They were just sitting there reciting the alphabet. It's not sufficient. And one of the problems is that with a population that's not that dense, it's not perceived as a problem because, until you get a real groundswell of opinion that is going to have the clout to perhaps raise a struggle or a fight, it's not perceived as a problem. We normally wait for fires to happen and then we put them out. And what we don't realise is that it's much smarter if we take preemptive measures to prevent fires from sparking. It's much cheaper, it's much more efficient, it's much better for the population. But, the kind of work that some of these NGOs have been doing in the east of Yemen has been fantastic at building cohesion. There's an annual camel race between the tribes. There are intertribal football competitions. And yet none of that is rated because from the outside it looks like, well, there wasn't a problem before and there isn't a problem now. So suddenly all of that work is just discounted. It's not taken into consideration.
And they have this kind of tribal gatherings, majlises and so on, where people come together?
Yeah, yes, there are several majlises. One project that I was very keen on helping with, however, was this huge survey so that we would have a data-driven idea of what people want for their future, rather than simply another majlis trying to speak for the people, claiming that they know what the people think. Let's ask, let's find out, and then let's act on that, and then you have community buy-in.
That's interesting. And it's obviously very tribal. Your loyalty is to your tribe. Whether the tribe is right, whether the tribe is wrong, you stand by your tribe. That would be fair to say?
I think that it is still strongly tribal, but not entirely. You know, there are geographical groupings now, and particularly with the influx of refugees from the crisis in the war in the west of Yemen, we perhaps are seeing a slightly more watered down, very gradually, a slightly more watered down tribalism. And I don't necessarily see that as a good thing, because of course in the absence of a state, in a security vacuum, actually the tribal structures become more important.
Of course they do.
Keeping justice, keeping peace, keeping stability.
And finally, just tell me, I mean, I always associate the little I know of Bedouin culture, which is limited to Oman, being both formal and very flowery. So, I mean, I remember in Oman, it mattered, the person who came into the room said Salam Alaikum, and then the person inside said Kif Halak, Kif Sahadak, and so on. And there was all this sort of marhabtain, and you know, this very flowery language that was used.
Yes.
That is, you don't get really in the cities and so on. It's not quite so elaborate, you know.
Yes, you get that. It's wonderful. The whole greeting is quite an elaborate ceremony. The khabur, and the person who gives the greeting, a fight almost breaks out about who's going to give it. Not because they all want to give it, because they all don't want to give it, because they're all trying to be humble. It's a real inverted version of how we might have it in the West, where everyone tries to be the big guy. Here, everyone's trying to give it to the next person. It's such a charming trait.
How wonderful. Gosh, I envy you. Well, I admire your courage, and I envy your adventure. What a wonderful thing. What a privilege to have you with us. Thank you so much for being our guest on ANN Television. Bless your heart.
My pleasure.
Thank you. What have we learned? I'm not sure what to say about the terrible situation in Yemen, the ongoing war, and whether there's any hope of peace. I really believe there should be. There's been some wonderful work done by the government of Oman on peace and rapprochement in Yemen, and I hope that there'll be a new way forward before too long. Well, in terms of al-Qaeda, it's interesting to hear how prominent they are and how ISIS, Islamic State, well, I call it Daesh, but I guess in a Yemeni context, it's, I hate to call it Islamic State. Do we call it the so-called Islamic State, like the BBC does? I mean, and yet it seems to give it a certain status to call it Islamic State that I feel it does not deserve. Certainly in Yemen, it is not a force as yet, and God forbid that it becomes a real force. And then, the whole question of jihadist poetry, what a revelation. I find it really fascinating to learn that it is such a major phenomenon. I always knew that poetry mattered in the Arab world, but to know that it's used in this context and in this way is intriguing, and it's something that we should be aware of. And it's a challenge to us, to our listeners too. I mean, social media is out there. If you believe that there is a better way than Daesh, than ISIS, then you should be writing poems on social media, using social media. And then the beauty of daily life in the interior. It is a way of life that we are losing. So many of us are losing. I mean, hospitality as a feature of life is a phenomena that we're losing in the West, have lost as we become more so-called sophisticated. It's wonderful the way people who are the poorest in our society can offer the most. And it really is an inspiration, a lesson we need to learn in the West from the Middle East, and a heritage the Middle East must never lose, because it is so precious. Thank you for being with us on ANN Television. Thank you for this time we've spent together. If you have any thoughts, if you have any ideas you'd like to share with us, do email. I believe the email address is on the screen now as we speak, and we would be grateful, very pleased to hear from you. Thank you again.